Do you ever notice that even small bits of feedback can feel like an attack? As if someone just exposed something deeply wrong with you. Have you ever found yourself spiraling after someone offers a little feedback, replaying it in your head, feeling accused, ashamed, or even enraged? Or perhaps you know someone who can't handle even neutral questions without getting highly defensive and reactive. Perhaps they lash out, turn it around on you, or shut down. Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, we're going to take a deep dive into what's known as narcissistic injury. Those moments when even the slightest feedback can feel like a personal attack. Have you ever found yourself reacting when someone points out something, and before you know it, you're flooded with shame, defensiveness, or even anger? Or what happens when someone dismisses your suggestion, advice, or offer to help them? How do you respond to that? Do you become enraged or withdraw? Why does that happen? What's actually going on inside someone who reacts this way? I can't speak to everything that gets stirred up internally, but I want to share what I most commonly discover in my work with patients when I get closer to these experiences. So, in today's discussion, I want to walk you through how I approach these reactions, how I help people begin to understand them, work through them, and eventually heal from the underlying injury that drives them. Let's start with a prototypical example or two, something that I think many of you will recognize. A typical way this presents, for instance, is a colleague at work pointed out something you could do differently. What was meant as constructive feedback instantly felt like an attack. Or at home, when your partner asked you if you had seen their shaving cream, and without missing a beat, you snap back, "I didn't touch it. Why do you always think I'm moving your stuff?" Or a friend teasing you about being late for plans, and suddenly you're flooded with defensiveness, insisting that he's always running late. Or maybe you accuse him of blaming you while not appreciating that there was traffic or you were busy at work. People respond differently when they feel criticized or judged. Some defend, others withdraw, some lash out. I've noticed among certain individuals a recurring spiral, an eruption of intense, self-directed rage. After the team meeting, where he spoke up, but was met with a challenge, he immediately shut down emotionally, and later that day turned on himself in the most brutal way, starting by calling himself a loser. In some cases, the self-attack escalates to yelling, sometimes even, and I quote, out loud. I want to come back to that later, so keep the out loud in mind. It's an important piece of this. And I quote here, "You'll never be successful," or "You always mess up," or "You're not capable, what an idiot you are." And in more extreme cases, the aggression can become physical, a pinch, a hit on his thigh, or a blow to his stomach, a way of acting out that inner punishment. In these more extreme cases, the aggression turns inward in self-directed violence. Hitting, pinching, or other forms of self-punishment take place. Sometimes it takes a less visible form, like over-drinking, neglecting one's body, or engaging in other self-injurious behaviors. There are many different ways of enacting the inner attack. As you can imagine, the mistake at work becomes more than just a mistake. It's internalized as a confirmation of internal defectiveness, and it proves that the person, in their mind at least, is fundamentally unworthy. Now, you may be wondering, why does this happen? Why does something so small set off such a powerful internal storm? What's actually getting touched inside the person in these moments of self-attack? Why self-abuse actually happens is a complicated question with many different answers, reflecting the complex nature of this reaction. In part, self-abuse can represent an attempt to manage unbearable, raw, undigested feelings that one cannot metabolize and put into words. Often, this can be traced back to early experiences where love and safety felt contingent on perfection. When one did not perform up to parental standards, there was a punishment of some sort. That punishment could take on many forms, from subtle emotional withdrawal, a look of disappointment, or a sigh that communicates, "You failed me," to overt criticism or shaming. You see, it exists on a continuum. So there could be actual overt criticism for making mistakes. And in more severe cases, it can escalate to physical violence, a smack of the child, or a beating, some sort of more severe punishment than the gaze that I just mentioned a moment ago, that looking down at gaze. Over time, these experiences shape an inner world where love feels conditional, where approval must be earned through, and I quote, flawless performance, and where mistakes evoke not understanding, but attack. Eventually, that punitive parental voice, that punitive way of relating, becomes internalized. What was once an external figure of judgment now lives inside of you, inside of your mind, attacking from within whenever you feel exposed, criticized, or less than perfect. In short, this suggests a deep identification with a critical other, possibly an early caregiver who demanded competence, perfectionism, and punished weakness or any demonstration that you had a need. When you make a mistake, or even when you're simply questioned, when there's an area that needs improvement at work, the self-inflicted punishment begins. The voice erupts, and I quote, "You effing loser." These are things I actually hear. The self-hitting and self-cursing that follow, these are not random outbursts. They're reenactments of that earlier relationship that I just described with a very punitive and punishing caregiver. So, today, what happens is a defensiveness as an immediate reaction to feedback of any sort. And this is what we call being narcissistically wounded. You may initially deflect and point out everything wrong at work, with a partner who misplaces the shaving cream, or with the friend, right, who joked with you about arriving late. Those are all deflections. And I'm just pulling on those earlier examples that I gave. But the point is, it gets deflected quickly in a sense, like in a highly defensive way. Then you may pivot, right? And point out everything wrong with yourself. I hope I'm beginning to describe both the narcissistic injury, that's the deep emotional wound that occurs when your self-esteem or your self-image is threatened in any way, often by criticism, rejection, or a failure that challenges your self-worth. And then there's the defensive structure. See, I hope I described that well, because what I want to do now is I want to show you how the psychodynamic therapeutic process gently loosens these immediate and intense reactions. With someone who is so guarded, so defensive, who meets any hint of criticism with either self-attack or that defensiveness, that counterattack, how does change actually happen? How do we begin to help someone who has spent a lifetime protecting themselves from feeling inadequate? Can you even reach someone like that when they're in, I quote, attack mode? And if so, how do you reach them? Often, what I found helpful is I start by naming what's happening. I'll notice aloud that in these moments, there's no compassion, no nuance, just a rigid, punitive lens that flattens their entire identity into the worst possible version of themselves. You're lazy, incompetent, fat, what a loser, you have no life, why did you speak up at that meeting, etc. That's what I'm beginning to demonstrate to them. So in treatment, the first task is to create enough emotional safety for these defenses to begin to soften, to help the person begin to notice and recognize the inner critic, to see when the voice, of that, again, internalized. Remember, that's the parental figure that you're carrying around inside of you. That internalized punishing parent comes alive, and to become genuinely curious about why it's there. In other words, get close to this, not further away. Don't try to get rid of it. I'm saying get closer to it, which I think is contrary to what you probably typically hear. Now, the goal isn't to confront the defenses head on, but to understand what purpose they serve. Defensiveness, self-criticism, even rage, these are not random reactions. They're protective structures that develop and are with you today for a reason. Yes, I know that sounds crazy, but I mean when I say a reason, that they're there for a purpose. They serve a purpose. We explore what this voice is trying to do, how, in its own distorted way, it may keep you safe from something even more painful. So paradoxically, it's there, believe it or not, helping and protecting you, yet at the same time, of course, destroying you and destroying your sense of self and self-esteem. Sometimes, as we begin to look more closely, a surprising observation emerges. The critical voice has also kept them company. In other words, that voice keeps you company. Not the most pleasant company to be around, but company nevertheless. It may feel harsh, attacking, or punishing, but it is present in moments of, and this is what I've come to discover over and over and over, in moments of loneliness, filling a space where connection was lost. And I quote, lost, because again, that's something I want to come back to. I mentioned earlier there was something else I was coming back to, but please keep this one in mind as well. So when the connection is lost or absent, that's when this voice frequently appears. And when I can help someone become curious about the voice, and when it appears, I often hear something, or I might hear something like this, and I quote, "What else can I do to not feel alone?" Now, earlier, I mentioned that this voice can sometimes feel so alive that it's not just heard internally, but spoken out loud, as if someone else is in the room. Remember, I said keep this in mind. I'm going back to that now. In these moments, when I inquire, "Who are you talking to?" I might hear something like this, and I quote, "This is the worst version of my parent." Or they begin to recollect a story where my parent, and I quote, "wasn't nice," or "wasn't accepting," or "reacted badly when I deviated from what they expected." Those are all quotes. But what I'm hearing is that when they're talking out loud to themselves, they're actually in a dialogue with a parental figure. So when the question arises, what else can I do to not feel alone? And I make the observation that aggression keeps her company. So in other words, you hear what I'm saying, that the aggression, as painful as it is, this voice keeps you company. We begin to see how one purpose of this dynamic is what? Self-punishment becomes a relational act, a way of recreating connection with a lost or internalized other, even if that connection is painful. That's the paradox there. But the painful connection is better than being in that moment of aloneness, of separation. And you can hear the separation because, again, when there's a criticism or feedback or a different opinion, or your comment in a board meeting or at work is not picked up, there's the moment of separation. There's not that togetherness that often is commonly sought out.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. In time, as we stay with the curiosity, not rushing to silence the inner attacks, but exploring what they protect, something begins to shift. Someone starts to give language. Remember I mentioned earlier, there are things that are undigested, unmetabolized. So the goal is someone begins to give language to what had only been acted out. That's the pinch or the punch or the defensiveness. So an example of this is when he says, and I quote, "If I navigate problems without getting so angry, defensive, or shutting down, I will feel a strong sense of confidence. And that's the problem," unquote. So yes, again, these are things that I typically hear, prototypical examples from my practice. What is the problem with confidence, I may wonder? See, at that moment, what's being articulated is a fear of agency and independence from this internal parental figure. Do you see what I mean by that? Confidence is a sense of autonomy. In other words, paradoxically, giving up the self-abusive stance, the critical voice, the defensiveness, risk stepping into your own authority, which is uncharted territory and can feel frighteningly vulnerable. It requires tolerating uncertainty, sitting with discomfort, and facing emotions that have long been avoided. Again, those are the undigested, unmetabolized pieces of information that I mentioned earlier. But it's also the very path. See, as they become metabolized and you put words to this, this is a path toward integration and healing. The admission, and I quote, "I literally talk to myself as if someone else is talking to me," is, I hope, beginning to resonate as a vivid, internalized dialogue. In other words, I'm hoping that you can begin to hear that this is the interaction that's going on. I talk to myself as if I'm talking to somebody else, or someone else is talking to me. Okay? So that's that whole internalized dialogue, again, with some critical, punitive voice, most likely derived from much earlier in life. And then what happens from there is you become trapped. And I use this word lightly, this word trapped, because it is both where you do and you don't want to be. Again, that's the paradox, and that's why this stuff gets so complicated. So you become trapped, again, using that word lightly, because you're not really trapped. You feel like you're trapped, but you become stuck in this dyadic loop where acts of individuation or moments of separateness, making a mistake, asserting a need, speaking up, right, expressing yourself, immediately trigger an inner retaliation as if the critical other was still present, and therefore you're never alone. You see, so in those moments when there's the possibility of being separate, alone, someone has a different opinion about how, you running late, the critical voice comes in, you're not alone. So for instance, someone is giving you feedback and you lose that blissful sense of togetherness, which you've heard me talk about quite frequently in prior episodes, the blissful union. So at some point, as I'm working with somebody like this, as we move closer to the fear of losing this internalized voice and all that it has come to mean to them, I may hear something like this. And I quote again, "Is there hope for me?" This question often arrives at the edge of something vital. It's not just about the treatment outcome. It's an emotional bid. In other words, what they're saying, the way that I hear that is, can I grow without being hurt? Can I grow without that internal abusive voice? Can I become someone new and survive while losing the parent that I depend on? Again, that's the internalized parent, remember. And also, will you, meaning me, that is, in the relationship, because they are asking me that question, will you leave me also if I change? And again, this is something I hear quite frequently, is if they get better, what does that mean for our relationship? And the end of it, that's the termination phase. That's when treatment starts to come to an end. In these moments, we see two things, right? We see both tension and possibility. On the one hand, The familiar defenses, the inner critic, and the hostile internal attack feel safer than the unknown of independence, being on your own to some extent without that voice out in the world. Now, on the other hand, a spark of agency begins to emerge. A reflective, more reality-oriented self starts to peek through. This part is curious and cautious, seeking ways to navigate the world while managing what is within its control. And again, I've spoken about this quite extensively in a 4-part series I recorded on healing narcissism and giving up the grandiose sense of self, the structure that holds them together. See, these things are very much related to one another because one can retreat into the grandiosity, much like they retreat into this punitive way of functioning. No doubt, when this is being relinquished and when one is beginning to come out, when they're beginning to emerge, when they're beginning to use their voice, this is a scary time. You've lived with this voice for so long, it's been your way of staying safe, never alone, even if painfully so. So what are the signs of healing? What are the signs of change? So when we start thinking about change, an example of that would be someone who struggled with feedback at work and felt overwhelmed may start to notice that others face, other colleagues face similar challenges. This introduces a modulating factor. Rather than interpreting every comment as a personal attack, now you begin to see and contextualize the difficulty, recognizing it as part of a shared human experience rather than simply proof of your defectiveness. In other words, I'll say that differently. You're beginning to notice that the feedback you get, maybe your coworkers get the same feedback. I mean, not the same, but they get feedback as well. So in this case, for instance, this person was able to tolerate ambivalence as they noticed other people are getting this feedback. It's not just me. It's not so personal. This is the ambivalence I'm referring to. So they're able to tolerate the ambivalence, reflect on his own performance. How am I performing? What do I think about this feedback? And even ask for help in areas where he could improve. So we're thinking about change, right? Signs of change. And this is a subtle shift. The ability to notice what's happening both internally and externally, like with your colleagues, to differentiate between internalized criticism and external reality. Other people are also getting feedback in this way. And then subsequently, to tolerate imperfection. Tolerating the imperfection presented itself in what way? To ask for assistance. So not only did you hear the feedback, you didn't become defensive, and you asked for assistance after the meeting. These are all glimmers of hope. They need to be pulled to the fore, however. They need to be named. They need to be nurtured in the therapy, because this is where the path toward autonomy, self-compassion, and true agency begins to emerge. As you come out of the psychic retreat, again, you've heard me use this concept before, and I'm promising you, because I got some questions on this, I'm going to do a much deeper dive into the psychic retreat because it encompasses so much of what we're talking about. But here, the psychic retreat is getting in your mind with the self-abusive talk, this dialogue that you get into, this interpersonal dialogue. So as you come out of the psychic retreat, the destructive dialogue in your head, right, that's the psychic retreat, you begin to step back from the relentless inner battle and gain brief moments of perspective, like I was just trying to illustrate. You may start to see yourself not just through the lens of the punishing, internalized parental figure, but as someone capable of tolerating that feeling I mentioned earlier, and I quote, aloneness, while simultaneously navigating challenges with some degree of assistance and togetherness. That's the example, asking for help. You see, that's the togetherness. The togetherness, though, implies that you come out of the psychic retreat. But these are the glimmers of hope. This is what begins to shift. In this emerging space, It's not just that the punitive inner voice loses some of its power, which is true, but you come to rely on it less. There's so much more. I want to keep talking about this. As always, there's so much more to say, and as promised, I will go into this in more detail. But I hope I gave you something, a different way to think about these things. This is a version of narcissism that is not just based on the narcissist controls you, or they manipulate you, or they avoid vulnerability. You see, I'm tackling this from a very different perspective. And what I've tried to capture is a narcissistic form of connection. See, this actually is connection, one that functions as a retreat from reality and mutuality. It's a closed circuit to self-relation, right, with that inner voice that replaces true contact. See, so true contact gets replaced with what? An internal dialogue, or more like an internal drama. You cling to the punitive inner voice as a way to not feel, again, I quote, alone. Yet that relationship exists entirely in fantasy. Remember, that's one of the things I said earlier on. That was the first way that I make an inroad into this. Remember, I said there's no nuance, there's no complexity, there's no ambiguity. So the relationship exists entirely in fantasy, in your head. In other words, it's a way of preserving a connection, even if that connection is cruel. Through a few prototypical clinical examples, I've tried to show how, when treatment deepens, a person gradually develops the capacity to take emotional risk, to engage more fully with reality, rather than retreat into the safety of that punitive inner world and then just continue to beat themselves up, if that makes sense. If that doesn't make sense, I trust you'll reach out, as you always do, with any questions, comments, or observations, so I can flush this out even further, if you like. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.